Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co host.
Christopher Wells.
Before we do our normal intro, we do have a major loss in the NBA community. Jerry West passed away on June 12th. The logo was an all-time great player and transitioned into executive roles for various franchises around the league. He catapulted, what we consider the modern NBA, especially considering what his nickname was. He was the logo and still is the logo of the NBA. So RIP to a legend. We do ask that you keep his family in your prayers and thoughts, through this very tough time for them.
Yeah, obviously, like you said, very transformational player in the league, right? Obviously played all of his entire 13-year career for the Lakers, right? Won a title with them, had a lot of great seasons, and then obviously eventually, right, worked his way into the executive role for the Lakers, right, and helped put together some great teams for them, right? Shaq and Kobe, right? And then obviously eventually they had a falling out, unfortunately, and then he left, went to Golden State, built up some of their championship teams, even went to the Clippers, although they did not win, right? He did put together, these recent Clipper teams, right, that had Kawhi and Paul George. Um, there as well. So obviously you can't tell the story of the NBA without him, right? Also, which was one that was, not mentioned as much, another NBA, guy, Chet Walker, also passed away not that long ago, at the age of 84, right? And he played for the Bulls for most of his career, right? Forward, really good player. So obviously just mentioned him as well. But yeah, so I mean at the end of the day, these guys are very, pivotal and crucial to the history of the game. So as you
Yeah.
said, we'd ask that you keep their family's thoughts with you.
Yeah. And kind of to lighten the moment, we do have a comment on our videos, and it's an interesting one, and I think it's a good one because we did recently do a collab with a certain
Mhm.
group, the Miami Heat Zone podcast, a frequent collaborator of ours. So I think it was Bryant Maudib commented, watched collab on a Heat show. Very cool. Definitely sub. Cheers. Yeah, we appreciate you coming on over. We hope that a lot of the guys who do watch the Miami Heat Zone podcast videos do come over and subscribe to us. They've shown us a lot of love, and they've allowed us to kind of be on their platform talking about what the Miami Heat should do in their offseason and stuff like that. So, like I said, we appeared on the Miami Heat Zone podcast and discussed a lot of things. So, shout out to Martell and shout out to the other guys involved on his channel.
Yep, exactly. So obviously, if you haven't already done so, subscribe to their channels as well.
Yes, please do. We'll leave the link of the collab in our description. And before we do get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so we are done with Game 3 of the NBA Finals in the books. The Boston Celtics, right, pretty much have put their stamp on this series, right? One win away from a title. They won 106-99. Very strange game, right? Where the Mavs at home played pretty well early on, built up a double-digit lead. Kyrie had a bounce back performance, right? Luka in the first quarter, first half was cooking. But then the Celtics punched back, right? They withstood the initial Dallas run, and then went on a big run of their own, right? And pretty much kept it within a few possessions for most of the first half, right? By the end of the first half, it was a 1 point game. It was a 1 point game at the end of the first quarter, right? Then the Celtics had a huge third quarter, held the Mavs to 19 points, went on a big run to pretty much, kind of put the game initially what it felt like out of reach. In the fourth quarter, they were up by as much as 21. And then quickly that lead was whittled down, right? I think the Mavs got it within to about, 1 point or 3 points. But then the Celtics, right, as opposed to kind of just wilting, right? Again, they withstood the run and they were able to bounce back and they were able to close the game out in impressive fashion, right? Jason Tatum and Jalen Brown were really the catalyst in this game on both ends of the floor, right? Tatum in the first half, right, had a huge first half, right, where he was shooting the ball well, attacking, getting to the free throw line. And then Jalen Brown closed it out in the second half, right? Both guys had basically 30 apiece. Brown had 8 rebounds and 8 assists. Tatum had 5 assists and 6 rebounds, right? So this was kind of their statement game, right? This was the game where, Jason Tatum, the first couple of games had struggled, right? At least from a shot making perspective, right? Did a lot of other things well, but you knew he could be better. And that was kind of if you're the Celtics, right, without Porzingis, who didn't play in this game, right? And Woj initially said that he may not be back the rest of the series, but in order to kind of counteract not having Porzingis, right? A counter that we described in the last live stream was that, well, Tatum could just have a big game, right? And again, he had a much better performance this time around, with Jaylen Brown also playing very well as well, right? Especially again, Jaylen Brown in the second half in the fourth quarter was huge, right? Even off the bench, he had a couple of guys off the bench that played pretty well, right? Sam Hauser hit some big threes, right? Played solid defense. Xavier Tillman, right, was the backup big that came off the bench after Al Horford, and he did a good job. He was switched on to Luca, right? Even made a three at one point, right? Obviously, he's not the tallest guy, right? He's about 6'7" or so, but he's strong, he's smart, he moves well. And it's kind of wild, right? Because that was a trade at the deadline that kind of went under the radar, right? Because obviously, that was a guy that, he actually did play, for the Grizzlies last season, right? When Adams was out, right? So he
Mhm.
played a lot against the Lakers, had a decent series. But, when he came to the Celtics, right, he would sometimes play and then sometimes not play. Um, played a decent amount during the stretch towards the end of the regular season, right, when they were kind of just going through the motion, and he helped them win a game, right? So again, as it's been pretty much most of the postseason, right, it was a great team win, by the Celtics, right, where it wasn't just one guy, or two guys that was doing everything. Like obviously, this was mainly a Tatum and Brown game, um, but the fact that what they're able to do as a team on both ends of the floor, it's a problem for Dallas, right? Because when you look at the Mavs, right, again, Kyrie had a bounce back performance. Luca, right, was didn't have as great of a game, right? He was +9, so obviously in the minutes he was out there, the Mavs were good. They did get killed when he was off the floor, which was rough. Even before he fouled out. But as people have mentioned, right, a lot of bad defensive possessions, a lot of silly fouls, some other possessions where, he's on the ground because he, is arguing with the official and they score. Not the first time we've seen a guy do that, won't be the last. It's just rough, right? And again, to be fair, you're not necessarily blaming him, putting him as the sole primary reason for why they lost the game. It's just, again, it's part of why the Celtics are a better team because they can kind of afford to have some games where, yeah, you don't have great, super efficient performances from your stars, but they can do other things on the other end of the floor as well. So it doesn't necessarily matter. And they have more talent, right? Like, when you look at the role players for Dallas, some of them just didn't play well, right? Like Gafford at 6 points, 3 rebounds, -11. Derek Jones Jr., 2 points, 3 rebounds, right? Maxi Kleba, unfortunately, right, with the shoulder injury, couldn't give him anything. They had to put out Tim Hardaway for offense. Pretty much did nothing on offense, right? We had somebody in the live stream comment, that he hadn't made a shot in about a month or so, which is just rough. And again, nobody's saying it's his fault, but it's just tough for the Mavs, right? Because when the Celtics starting five is as good as they are, even without Porzingis, you need a few additional guys who can kind of come out there and help you on both ends of the floor. And it just kind of feels like by the time you get to this Celtics series, some of those guys, some of the role players for the Mavs, it's a little bit, out of their wheelhouse where they may just not be able to get it done against this specific Celtics team. Um, and in addition, Boston was able to do a decent job for most of the series on Luca and Kyrie together, right? Where there were no games where both of them, were great at the same time. I mean, even though they had a combined 62 points, didn't matter. So, I mean, at the end of the day, this was why we picked the Celtics to win the series. It's not because the Mavs stink. It's not because they're a fraudulent team. It's just the Celtics are better, right? And obviously, again, it validates the duo in terms of the Jays, and it also definitely elevates Jaylen Brown, right? Who is probably going to win Finals MVP at this point, and wasn't even All NBA. Um, so I mean, like I said, it doesn't really change my views on Dallas that much. And obviously, we'll get into that more once the season or series is over. But, it just kind of validates how good the Celtics were over the course of the season. Even if you felt like that they didn't necessarily play a lot of great teams, it still validates how good they were.
Yeah, I mean they had the best record in the NBA for a reason. We've talked about it multiple times. Me personally, I don't think they had a cakewalk. I guess you could say technically, yeah, because they did face a lot of injured teams. But at the end of the day, even if those teams were at full health, I think their leagues above
I
them.
agree.
That
I
that
agree.
that's kind of like the sentiment that I'm kind of rolling with here. But yeah, I think you talked about it good. Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, they showed up. And that's exactly what you need, and everybody really showed up. And I think offensively, what they were able to execute against Dallas also was really cool as well. Cause, you look at what they're able to do in their 5-out sets, with the drive and kick, he had some amazing passes, I think, from a lot of players, if not all, from the starting five. You had Drew Holiday with an amazing kick out pass to D White. And then obviously Jason Tatum is able to do that as well, along with Jaylen Brown. So it's kind of awesome to see, what they're able to do on offense and how well they execute it, because that five out set is something serious. Dallas can't rotate quick enough. They don't have the personnel to really stop that. And I don't know if anybody in the NBA does right now. But defensively, also what they were able to do against Dallas was interesting. They kind of, I'm not going to say like walled off the paint per se, but they took away a lot of the role players. I guess lanes to the basket. You look at Derrick Jones Jr. He didn't really have a lot of attempts. I think he only had 2 attempts. So keeping him at a low volume is good. But he also only played 16 minutes. Gafford as well. Derek Lively. Kind of keeping these guys at bay is kind of what you need to do. Considering that Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic, like you said, they combined for 60 points, but at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. I guess, what you saw from Kyrie. It was better, than the first 2 games, but by the time the fourth quarter came around, you were like, yeah, there's just no use because he can't do it by himself. I think he needs Luka and Luka needs Kyrie at this point, but they both need to be kind of on their A game and their P's and Q's, or else you get a game like this where one of them's not focused, unlocked, and then stupid stuff starts to happen, like you talked about with Luka on the floor, fouling out, kind of flailing around, and I think that's a big difference between the Boston Celtics and the Dallas Mavericks as well. The discipline. The Celtics had a lot of calls that didn't go their way. So did Dallas, clearly. But you didn't see anybody, on the floor flailing around, borderline technical stuff for Boston. They kind of kept their composure. Obviously, they have the right to do so if they're up in the series. But at the end of the day, I think there's a level of class that Boston kind of operates with, the players, that is. And it clearly reflected as for sure, going into the fourth quarter and how they were able to close this game out. But overall, we talked about it on the live stream. A lot of people have kind of been hating on this finals, but I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I think, if you're a real basketball fan, you can appreciate what the Celtics have been able to do on both ends of the floor this season, especially, at a historic rate.
Yeah. And that's at the end of the day, that's what the Celtics are. They're a very good basketball team and they play basketball, I guess, quote unquote, the right way, right? Where again, it's a lot of really good reads, ball movement, not necessarily a ton of overly selfish play. Obviously, again, it's not like you have like, a number, like best player in the league type guy that you're just running everything through. But, they don't need that because they have a lot of really good players on both ends of the floor. It's a
Mm-hmm.
very well constructed roster. And again, they showed over the course of this postseason, why they probably should have been, the team picked to win the title as opposed to a lot of these other teams.
Sure.
And again, there are other teams that I think would match up better against the Celtics, but they didn't get to the finals. It was Dallas. So, and ultimately, I don't think Dallas matches up well against this Celtics team.
Yeah. And I don't really know where you go from here if you're Dallas, like we talked about, and like we pretty much,
Right.
talked about on our short. The series is over.
Yeah.
3-0. I think that's a mountain that nobody has ever climbed, obviously.
Nobody's
But
ever done it. Not
yeah,
in the NBA, at least. I
yeah,
think it's happened maybe in baseball, maybe, but
yeah.
not in.
But but come on, man. We're I don't think, at this point we're not at that level of
No.
concern, I think, or fraudulent for Celtics, hate and stuff like that. So I just think the series is over, like you talked about, and there's
Yep.
nothing that you can really do if you're Dallas. I mean, maybe you can
Yeah.
hope for a gentleman's sweep at best, but we talked
Yeah.
about on the live stream. We think it's going to be a legit sweep. We think it's going to be 4-0.
Yeah.
So talk to
That's
me about what your expectations are for like game 4, because with
yeah.
game 3, there's not a whole lot to say. We recapped it, but like the takeaways are going to be kind of the same, and they're going to carry over into game 4 most likely.
Yeah. Yeah, it just feels like it at this point because you've kind of had a few different guys go off in each game for Boston. And, again, like, because, you had a game, the first 2 games where Tatum wasn't as dominant scoring wise, right? But Brown was good, Porzingis was good, and both guards were good, right? In this game, you didn't have as dominant of a performance offensively from the guard. They were
Mhm.
still there defensively, which is always the nice piece. But Tatum and Brown were great, right? So then obviously you could go into the next game and it could be a scenario where everybody plays well, right? Because obviously now at this point, if you're the Celtics, there's no more pressure. You're up 3-0. Obviously, the closeout games are the hardest, but at this point, you pretty much can tell that both teams kind of know that this is over in the sense of Boston has Dallas's number. And I just don't really think at this point there's anything that the Mavs can really do. unless it's just like a scenario where Luca and Kyrie are great and everybody for the Mavs shows up, and it just doesn't feel like that's going to happen because Boston's been able to shut the other guys down as well, not just Luca and Kyrie, right? Because obviously Lively was good in the last game, but I think that has more to do with Porzingis being out, right? Where when he's out there, it's just very difficult for both bigs to be good at different points, and not having a stretch big at all, that can kind of allow you to match what Boston does in terms of 5 out because Kleba can't shoot, because of his shoulder. That hurts as well. But either way, I think this is probably done. Like maybe you might get a better game like from both Luca and Kyrie where both of them are efficient. But it probably doesn't really matter, right? Because they could still play well and then they could still lose just because the Celtics, just have more guys, right? Like at the end of the day, with or without Porzingis.
Yeah, and it's like, offensively, I think going into game 4, as great as they were on offense in this game 3, I think in game 4 they might be even better. And I think they're going to generate a lot of open looks like they did in game
Yeah.
3, even better open looks, and that's the beauty of what they're able to do. The ball movement and the spacing that they're able to create. A lot of the shots that they missed weren't contested. They were wide open. So I'm kind of expecting those to fall at an even more efficient rate. I think they're hungrier, they're locked in, you can see it. And, them winning this game in the way that they did without Porzingis, I think is the huge telltale sign, that there is no shot that they're going to win, that Dallas will win game 4. I just don't see
Right.
it. There's not a recipe because you need somebody else off the bench and you don't have it, like you talked about. You can't really lean on a Kleba. You definitely can't lean on Tim Hardaway Jr. I guess Lively, but he's not a, prolific scorer or anything. He's going to give you like 10 points and, a double double or something like that. Green,
Jaden Hardy.
Exum, Jaden Hardy, like these are guys that are not going to give you enough juice that you need to kind of put you over the edge versus, Boston, where, they might have a game where Sam Hauser doesn't miss from the 3-point line, or, a similar one where he goes 3 for 4, like in game
Mhm.
3, and that's 9 points, and that puts you over the edge because your bench actually showed up, So that's kind of how I feel about this going into game 4. Obviously, Boston has more weapons. Obviously, their starting 5 is more talented. The same old story from game 1. Just as kind of how we predicted. Obviously, we might have given Dallas a little bit too much of a way out, or a little bit of leeway, because we did say Boston in 6, but you know it's looking like a sweep to me. So
Yeah. Markeith Morris, maybe?
I mean, if he makes an appearance, cool, but
No,
I don't think
I'm,
he. I
no,
know.
I'm
Yeah,
just, yeah, yeah.
that guy's not gonna put up probably more
If
than
he
like
plays,
5 points.
it's because it's garbage time. If he plays, it's because it's garbage time. It's not like an
Yeah,
actual. I'm not trying to pick on him or
I know.
anything. It's just like, I mean, at this point, what can you really do? Like
I mean,
Dwight Powell, is he gonna play again? Are they gonna revive him? Probably not. So
yeah, I don't think that wouldn't be smart in my opinion. I would just go with your rotation. Don't go too deep in your bag, and I think that was an issue that they had in this game in the first place. Playing 11 guys is kind of wild. I think in the NBA
yeah,
Finals, that means you're kind of reaching, and that shows your desperation.
right, exactly. When you do that, it means that you're not quite sure who to turn to. And for the Celtics, they don't have to put out 11 guys because they know exactly which guys they can put out there, with or without Porzingis, right?
Yeah,
Like even a guy like a Peyton Pritchard played 11 minutes, didn't really do much, but say Xavier Tillman played 11 minutes, and in the minutes he played was very impactful.
yeah, he was
So,
active all over the place, and I think that's the
mhm,
thing with Boston. All their guys are kind of built that way, where you know, and somebody on our TikTok commented about Game 2. They talked about Jason Tatum and his lackluster shooting, but they were like, him almost having a triple, or him having a triple double on
mhm,
poor shooting speaks volumes, because he's still able to do everything else at a very efficient and talented rate, because he's able to play make, he's able to rebound, and he's definitely able to play defense. But he doesn't need to score when you have other guys that can fill in the gaps so easily, and that's why they're the more complete team, and that's why a lot of people did pick Boston. And that's why they're the favorites going into this outside of the record. You have to look at the construction of the team. And, the way that Dallas is constructed is very, very different. It's very reliant on Kyrie Irving, very reliant on Luka Doncic. And you kind of can see the gaping holes that are present. You see, obviously, why they got to this position, which is Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic. But you can also see, why they are in this predicament, being down 3-0 or 0-3, excuse me.
it's just a tough matchup against the Celtics, and that's why we picked them in the first place. I know that there were a lot of analysts that picked the Mavs because of the Luca Kyrie factor. I just don't think it really matters against this Celtics team because again, they could score 70, but then the Celtic starters could score like 100, which hasn't even really happened at this point, which is where, yeah, this is where the game 4 could be bad, where it's like, everybody, because again, the Celtics, the first 2 games didn't shoot that well from 3 as a team.
Hmm.
This game, they shot much better, right? 37% on 46 attempts or whatever. But, they could have, if they have like a hot night, yeah, then that's pretty much a wrap, which they haven't had in a while.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, at this point, there's not as much, analysis to really break down
Yeah.
because it really does feel like that this series is pretty much over, right? I mean, obviously, I guess, in terms of who we expect to be Finals MVP, probably Jalen Brown. Maybe it swings to Tatum, possibly if he has like a really good game 4,
Yeah.
maybe. But I don't know. It feels like it might be Brown at this point.
I
I don't know.
mean,
What do you think?
if we're handing out the award now, it goes to Jalen Brown for me. He's been their energy guy. He's been awesome. I think on both ends of the floor. So is Tatum.
Mhm.
But the
Yeah,
counting stats and the efficiency, I think from Jalen Brown, you feel it a little bit more, especially in their wins.
right. Yeah,
And that's
I feel
really
like
been
I feel
throughout
like
the postseason. But going
yeah,
specifically this finals, yeah, I would say
yeah.
it's Jalen Brown.
I think it should be Brown, but I feel like there is a world where like if Tatum has a good game 4, they might just swing it and be like, well, he had 2 really, really good games. So, and he had a triple double in game 2, so we could just give it to him. Like I
Sure.
mean, I could be wrong. Like I said, I think it should be Jalen Brown, but of course it's not based off of 3 games, it's based off of 4. So if he has a really good game, it could be him, but it doesn't really matter, right? Like both
Yeah.
of them played well enough, to win. So
Yeah.
at the end of the day.
If it's like if Tatum has like a monster, like you said, 40-point game where he's efficient and he can't miss and he's doing everything on the boards, defensive end as well, and also has a lot of highlight plays. Because the thing with Tatum is we haven't really seen a lot of highlight plays, and we know he's not like the flashiest guy, but highlights
Brown.
kind of sell. And that's why I
Yeah.
think Jalen Brown might have the edge because he's
Yeah.
had some crazy dunks and some crazy
Yeah.
plays on the defensive end. Obviously sharing the
Yeah.
block with D White. So there's a lot of things that kind of go
Yeah.
into being
They're
Finals
both
MVP.
they're both athletic, but Brown's a more explosive athlete, right?
Yeah, for
Tatum is
sure.
more of like a smooth athlete.
Yeah, because I think
So
a lot of people have been talking about Jalen Brown's in-game finishing, and that was hilarious. Going back to all the way back to the dunk contest. I know it was abysmal. I don't think we should be
yeah.
bringing it up, but he's one of
Nope.
the better in-game dunkers, in-game finishers
Right.
that we have in the league today, and that's because of his ability to get downhill, and then obviously his
Right.
ability to kind of change hands, and that's hilarious considering the meme. Like, yeah, the guy doesn't have a left hand.
Yeah. Exactly. So I
Yeah.
mean, at the end of the day, yeah, that's what it feels like at this point. But they're 1 win away, so they pretty much all but wrapped up. In terms of how far this series can really go, right? Because again, like we thought it would go longer, but we still thought the Celtics would win.
Yeah,
So,
and it's
like I said, not
hilarious.
yeah, it is. And again, I can't take a victory lap because they were my preseason pick, but not the final pick.
I
So it's
know.
like I can't even really say anything at this point. But either way, I felt pretty good about how good they were as a team because I think both you and I thought going into the season that they were going to be the best team in the East, right? Because I know
Yeah.
some people thought Milwaukee, and I guess that was pretty much like those 2 teams. I think because I don't think people really expected like New York to come out of the East
Mm-mm.
or maybe Philly, but
Mm-mm.
outside of those 3, right, like nobody else. And I just thought the Celtics were better, and that's what they've proven.
Yeah, and I feel like with New York, they're more of like a pleasant surprise, and then with Boston,
Yeah,
it was kind of like
right.
the inevitable. Everybody knew deep down that they
Yeah,
were gonna be in the NBA Finals. You predicted that they were gonna win. This was their
mhm,
title year, um,
right.
and it's a long time coming. If you look at the journey, that the Celtics have had since what, that 2008 title, they blew up the core with Paul
Yep.
Pierce, Garnett. Then you had the horrible years where
Mhm,
they didn't have anything going for them. Then obviously you get the good picks, Jalen Brown,
yeah.
Tatum, Kyrie. You even had the Isaiah Thomas era. Just completely
Yeah,
skipped over that. And it's
yeah,
all
and I was
built
gonna
up
say
to this moment, which is awesome.
yeah, and I was gonna say, funny enough, like if you actually go through the timeline, right? So like you said, win the title in 2008, against the Lakers. I think Bynum didn't play, but they still won, right? 2009, I think Garnett gets hurt, so then they can't go back to back.
Hmm.
2010, they're in the finals. I think Perkins is out against the Lakers, right? The Lakers win. And then, they can't get back to the finals, right? Then 2013 is like the last run, lose in the first round of the Knicks. Then they make the trade with the Nets where it's basically highway robbery, right? They got multiple picks back for Garnett and Pierce when they were pretty much done. And then after that, even though, you mentioned the horrible years, they weren't really that bad for that long, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like, I think they missed the playoffs in 2014, right? But then I think 2015 they got back in it, right? They were just I think they were a 7 seed or whatever against Cleveland, right? Because
Hmm.
that was when Olynyk was there, when he had the thing with Love. So they
Yeah.
didn't weren't even that bad for that long. Because they ended up trading Rondo, I think, that year, and then that was like the last remnants of that Celtics team,
Right.
right? And like you said, and they ended up bringing in Isaiah Thomas over from Phoenix. Then they had the years, right, with him and Horford, right? And then eventually they draft Brown, right, third, right? And that was the pick I think people were very surprised and shocked by because, of those three picks, Simmons, Ingram, and Brown, he was the most raw, right?
Sure.
And so, and I don't know how many people saw a ton of potential in him as like an all-star type guy, but he got better each year, right? Obviously. And, that was, and it kind of went from like him being like the surprise pick to he's, at this point, the best of those three.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
So,
And
and then
it's
after,
been a
right,
huge build up, man.
yeah, and then like you said, after that, right, then eventually they get Kyrie from Cleveland, right, traded Isaiah Thomas. He gets hurt, and Hayward gets hurt, right, because they took Hayward from Utah. Still
Yep.
go to the conference finals, right, which is an accomplishment, that early on. Lose to Cleveland with LeBron, and then they're pretty much, in that mix basically every year, right? They lost in the second round with Kyrie. He leaves. Then they go back to the conference finals, and it's built around Tatum and Brown. They bring in Kemba Walker. He eventually gets hurt, so he's done. Um, Switch guys around, and like you said, now it's gotten to this moment where like last year, obviously was really rough. They got to the conference finals, went down 3-0, tied the series up, then blew it in game 7, right? Year before they got to the finals, which was an accomplishment. I don't think that was expected at the beginning of that season, but they
Right.
got there and lost in pretty rough fashion to Golden State where they were up 2-1. But now they've gone through those battles, and now they've come out stronger and also just better as well. So
Yeah.
now everything's kind of come up to the been built up to this moment, and now they're right on the precipice of winning the NBA title.
Yeah. You know, it's really cool to see. Like you talked about, you just mapped out the entire journey for all of us. And yeah, if you've been watching basketball for as long as we have, then like you've seen all these kind of years. Maybe it hasn't been in your forefront vision, but kind of like to play it back in your head is kind of wild to think about, considering all the players that have worn jerseys, players who aren't there, and then the players that are still there, like Jalen Brown and Jason Tatum. Committing to that duo is awesome. They doubled down on it. And a lot of people, I think a lot of people had a lot of questions, rightfully so, especially after
Right.
last year. That was a huge, I think, blow up, a huge disappointment, obviously.
Yeah.
Because that year, they were supposed to go to the finals last year.
Yeah,
Everybody knew that.
last year was mapped out for them to get there against the Heat, and they blew it. The
Yeah,
Heat took it from them.
exactly. And to see them kind of rally back and get right back into gear, and not really falter at all, and are honestly, clearly, get better is really cool to see. No matter how
Yeah.
you look at it in terms of like
Who
if
would
you
have
hate them or not.
who would have thought that the Pacers series would have been actually really the most, competitive as
I know,
opposed to any of the other ones? Like who would have thought? Like, and that was the team that people probably believed in the least against Boston
sure.
compared to the other ones. Like in that's just kind of wild.
Yeah, it is pretty cool, like to think about, you know, and I think it was Martell when we were talking, off camera, obviously. Um, we were talking about the Bucks and stuff. Like they didn't play the Bucks, they didn't play the Sixers.
Yeah,
So
and I think that's where yeah, and I think that's where people, come up with the cakewalk takes from.
yeah, but it's like they don't choose their opponents. Like, and at the
Right,
end of the
right.
day,
Like
they would have won those series. I think obviously they might have looked a little different coming into this finals matchup, but like I think they still would have beaten this Mavericks team. You know?
yeah. And at this point, like, it also doesn't really matter. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
because we always have that every year. It's where it's like, oh, if this team had gotten to this point, like, maybe this happens, but then it doesn't, right? Like basketball and sports in general is always full of what ifs, and it's like because there's other what ifs that that we've talked about at previous points too. Even like last season. So, at the end of the day, I mean, like you said, you can't really control who's in front of you. I mean, it would have been a lot worse if they had lost to any of those teams. So,
My point, yeah, and they handled them, light work. They were light work. Um, like you said, the
yeah,
Indiana
like
one
basically,
was a little bit
yeah,
more challenging, but at the end of the
yeah,
day,
like essentially,
nobody was worried.
yeah, like essentially, this is what they're supposed to do. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, if you're the team that people think that you are, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to run through everybody, right? Obviously, like you still have to do it, but obviously, like you know, when if you believe that the Celtics are as good as you think they are, then this is where you're not really concerned about them losing to any of these teams. Like we weren't really concerned about them losing to the Mavs because we thought that they were the better team. Even if you can say like, yeah, they may not have an individual player like Luca, but they have a lot of really good players to where it doesn't really matter because we've seen top tier players lose series um where they may be the best player like in terms of rankings, but the other team just is better, right? Because we saw that, like we
Yeah.
saw as you pointed out, right, like in a couple of those Cleveland Golden State series, right, where like LeBron's playing against Golden State, but that Golden State team is just better, right? Like the 2018 one, it's like, I mean, it's LeBron, Kevin Love, George Hill, J.R. Smith, and
Right.
Tristan Thompson. It's like there's nothing they could have done, they could have done to win that series. So it didn't really matter how well he played unless he gives you like 50 every game.
Right,
So
exactly. And it's like,
yeah,
that's unrealistic. Obviously, your star player is going to have great games, but don't expect him to play like God, every single game. That's just not possible. And,
mhm,
2018 Braun was the best player in the NBA at the time. And I think it's
yeah,
very similar. Obviously, I think the talent is better on Dallas. I'm going to always say that. The talent is better
mhm,
on this Dallas roster than it was on the 2018 Cleveland Cavaliers. But you look at the
mhm,
similarities, and it's very, very similar in terms of what Luka has been able to do this entire season. Obviously the record isn't amazing, but it's a complete switch of identity. So give them another season, and I think you could probably see Luka, getting that MVP at some point. But you know, I think he's been putting up MVP numbers. He's I think proven that he's been the best player in the NBA this season. Going through the postseason. So that's where I was
mhm.
kind of drawing the comparison, where it's like Luka's the best player in the NBA, but the Celtics have so much more talent cumulatively.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, like I don't think if you're Dallas, you shouldn't look at this as like, like a horrible season. Like I know
No,
obviously there's gonna be a lot of criticism thrown towards Luca's way because of the fact that, of what happened in the series. But, at the end of the day, right, I think he will, get better, and learn from this type of stuff, right? Because he's 25, right? So like I don't think you can necessarily write him off just like you couldn't write the Celtics off. When they had their, rough series in the past, right? Now, obviously, Dallas's team, right, is a lot different from Boston. So, do I necessarily expect the Mavs to be in the finals next season? No, not necessarily.
down the
But
line though,
obviously,
absolutely.
right? Yeah, like I expect them to be one of the top 4 or 5 teams in the Western Conference. Like I expect them to be one of the last teams standing,
Right.
right? Like to me, if they don't like I would expect them given what they have around them, they shouldn't go out in the first round. They should be a team that should be one of the home court teams each year, and at least worst case scenario, go out in the second round.
Right. And this is the thing. Um some of these stars, they need this kind of experience. This is Luca's first finals,
Right.
It's not very often that you see a player of his caliber kind of just not necessarily pop onto the scene, because we know that he's been around and he's been in the league for a decent amount of time now. But for his first finals
Hmm.
appearance and to have it be a W, I think that would have been,
Yeah.
insane. You look at Tatum. Take Tatum in Boston, for example. We saw this team, albeit very different now, but we saw Jason Tatum, Jalen Brown in the finals, and they lost, and it happens. And they use that
Yeah.
experience and they rallied, and look at them now. They're one win away from the NBA Finals trophy. So, don't I wouldn't like people should not be saying like Luka's never going to win a title. He'll win one
Yeah.
down the
Yeah.
line. It's just, he needs to use this experience as a learning one, build from it and get better, in terms of what he's able to do and when he's able to show up.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's again, this should be a learning experience. This shouldn't be, you know, a black mark, on a guy, right? Where
No.
it's like, yeah, like could he have had a better series? Sure. But at the end of the day, you know, he got him to this point, and they weren't good enough to get it done. But that doesn't necessarily mean this is what it's forever destined to be.
Exactly.
Yeah. So now, again, we're pretty much, almost wrapped up with the NBA finals. So I guess now, we could pretty much get into some of the news, and rumors going on, around the league, right? So
Yeah.
obviously, we can talk about some stuff that's going on, right? Obviously, there's some stuff going around about so Sham Charania, he thinks that Jimmy Butler is probably going to stay in Miami. Which is interesting, right? Because obviously we've heard stuff, about the idea of teams that might be, interested in trading for him, right? He said on the Pat McAfee show, he loves it in Miami. He's eligible for an extension. There are multiple teams out there that would give him one, but he believes that he doesn't want to be, that he doesn't want to go anywhere else. And that's where I think, with Miami, I think it's unlikely that he leaves unless he says he wants out because of the fact that like he went there, right? He's a big, part of the identity. Obviously, both you and I have, expressed the idea that they should probably trade him while they still can. It doesn't mean that they will, right? But obviously, you got to factor in a lot of stuff. But it seems like that he is probably going to stay. Of course, that's according to Sham Charania. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% true. Obviously, he got a big win, in the Shams Woj Wars, which we'll talk about, soon. But yeah, just kind of give your thoughts on this.
I mean, it's interesting, and I've heard a lot of rumors. There's rumors like swirling. Like, you could look at the opposite side where people are saying, "Oh yeah, he might be going to the Warriors or something like that." People are saying that's kind of heating up. But at the end of the day, it's Miami's choice. If they want to build around him, which I think it's possible to get to the finals with him. We've seen it, a couple of times actually. So it's possible, but I feel like they just need one or two more pieces to get over the line if you do, want to build around Jimmy Butler. And that would kind of be having to move a guy like Tyler Hero and another piece as well. The question is, that guy's value isn't super high. So you're not going to get back that kind of caliber player that I think you would really need or want to get you over the hump. So that's kind of like the debacle that they're wrestling with. But, I get it. You don't want to necessarily just blow everything up because I think, if you move on from Jimmy Butler, that is a form of blowing it up because that is your star player that has been your best guy. Obviously, Bam probably won't go anywhere. So, it just raises more questions. Can Bam be the leader to kind of bring you over the hump as well? Because you don't want to fall into a repeat situation where you're contending
Mhm.
every year, but you never really win anything because of the ceiling of your best player.
Yeah, like essentially, you have to choose if you're Miami. Do you want to keep this squad around and continue to try to contend,
Hmm.
or do you pretty much throw in the towel and say we had a decent run, but it's probably time to blow it up, and we'll see what they do.
Right.
But obviously, if you're gonna go in, you got to go all in. But if you're not, then you should probably blow it up.
Yeah.
There's no real reason to kind of keep all of these guys around. If you're just not going to contend, right? Because like obviously you keep Bam, and some of your young guys, assuming you can. But like, if you're not going to try to contend, then you probably want to trade Butler. But again, also you have to factor in what he wants because he's probably built up enough equity in that organization that they may just not necessarily trade him just because he would probably have
Easily.
to ask out. Yeah, and if he doesn't want out, probably not. He's probably not going.
Right.
Um, then also in addition, right, for the Cavs, right, according to Jake Fisher, Yahoo Sports, right, they are unlikely to trade the core four, not expected to be moved, Mitchell, Garland, Allen, or Mobley. Apparently Garland's trade market has also cooled off. So kind of interesting, right? I don't know. I don't want to necessarily say I don't believe it, but it is just kind of, intriguing how we had heard so much about, like if Mitchell signs the extension, right, then Garland's going to ask for a trade. And, now we're hearing more and more that Mitchell might sign that extension. So, what do you expect the Cavs to do this offseason? Like, do you expect them to re sign Mitchell and then just try to keep everybody? Do you expect Garland to try to, force his way out of there? Or do you just kind of think that, they just kind of keep everything for now and then maybe down the line, maybe like something else happens?
I don't know. It's a tough read because I think it's tough to predict considering Mitchell hasn't signed the extension. That's what I'm
Right,
really waiting for. But let's
right.
just say for this scenario he does sign it. Okay, cool.
Mm,
I think those two in Garland and Mitchell probably can't coexist in a, healthy environment because I think,
Mhm,
they're both ball dominant. They're both I think Garland is less of a volume shooter, I would say. I think he could be a better playmaker, better passer. But Donovan
mhm,
Mitchell's a very high volume guy. But regardless, they both need the ball to do what makes them great. And that's not really a recipe for success, I think. It would be cool if you had a guard and a wing who could do that.
mhm,
But, when you have two guards, two small guards, two guards that aren't good at defense, yeah, I
mhm.
think that raises a lot of issues and concerns, especially also not even, bringing up Evan Mobley and Jared Allen and their potential, ability to coexist as well. So I think you kind of have to choose. Do you want to go with your young guys, all of your young guys, or do you want to kind of go with your win now move? And I think if obviously if Mitchell resigns the extension, I think Garland will probably not necessarily. It's hard for a guy like him to ask out because he doesn't really have like a whole lot of like you were talking about equity with Jimmy Butler. Um, but, that wouldn't surprise me if like Rich Paul comes out and says like, "Yeah, we don't really want to be here anymore." Because
Yeah,
that's a bad situation at the end of the day. It's two guards that probably just won't work.
right, yeah, and that's the tough part where it feels like what Cleveland should do may not necessarily be what they actually do, right?
Exactly.
Where I think like both you and I feel like you might want to move on from Mitchell and just kind of get what you can, and
Yes.
then just kind of just roll the dice on the young guys, even if it doesn't necessarily work out, right? Just because I mean, there's still a world where like he signs the extension and then a year later just asks out again. Like
Exactly.
obviously, I guess yeah. So like I guess you have him, but if he signs, but I mean, if he's willing to sign the extension, then you kind of have to let him sign the extension. It's
Right. Right.
just
Right.
I would just be kind of interested to see where this goes because initially coming off the series, I think we probably expected him to probably be gone. But now a lot of people have kind of been saying that he might stay. But it's been kind of like back and forth, so we don't really know for sure. But as of right now, a lot of people are reporting that he might stay. So we'll
Yeah.
see. Right, this is obviously a changing situation.
Because it's such an awkward situation because he left Utah
Hmm.
because they weren't winning in the playoffs. And then you
Right,
go to Cleveland to, build something bigger and better, and you're not
not really
winning
that.
in the playoffs. So it's like
Yeah, it's not really
that's what makes me feel like he's gonna be out of there. And
right.
I'm
It's not
sure
really much.
he wants to win.
Right. It's just a matter of then after that, where does he go? Because there are some teams where if he goes there, it's gonna be probably the same thing. So, that's where I don't really know what necessarily happens with that, which is why that might be where he could stay, right? Where it's like maybe he specifically may just be better suited to just hang around in Cleveland, but we just don't really know based off of what they've done at different points. We
Because
just have really no idea.
what do you think of Garland's value? Do you think it's high? Do
Right.
you think it's low? Because I think it's
Um,
like plateau. I think it's mid at best, just considering he had a down year and in the playoffs he was very bad. Obviously, we
yeah.
talked about it, the jaw injury. You can't eat
Mhm.
solid foods for however long. So he lost a lot of weight, so that impacted him. But I
Yeah.
think the potential is like kind of the factor where people are
Right.
like, okay, he's got a lot of potential. Is that
Mhm.
enough to kind of
I
sell
think
some of our pieces?
it could be down from last year, and maybe that's why Cleveland wouldn't be all that interested in trading him,
Right.
where they probably know that they're not going to get a whole lot back. But then, like if you're another team, that's where like yeah, maybe you should buy low because then if you believe he'll have a bounce back year, then you could have a really good point guard, right? Like if you're
Exactly.
the Spurs or somebody like that that needs a point guard, you could just be like hey, let's give Cleveland some picks and a players that we don't necessarily want, and then see if we can get them. But if Cleveland doesn't want to do that, then there's nothing you could really do.
Right. Yeah. That's like the two biggest things is what is
Right,
Garland's value, and then also Donovan Mitchell needs to either sign or not sign.
right. And then after that, they still obviously have to pick their coach, right? According to Yahoo Sports, right? They've scheduled some head coaching interviews: James Borrego, Kenny Atkinson, Mike Nori. Now it sounds like he might be James Borrego, the leader for the Cavs job.
Okay.
Which would be interesting at this point. He was initially at one point. It sounded like a leader for the Lakers job. Obviously, it's been a while since we've last recorded an episode, right? But since we said that Hurley was going to be the Lakers coach, that ended up not happening at all. He ended up staying at UConn. Obviously, the final offer I think was lower than what some people had reported. I think there was a guy, John Fanta, I think, who was a college reporter, and he was saying that the Lakers were gonna the supposed offer was gonna be like 8 years, 100 million. But Woj put out that the actual offer ended up being 6 years, 70 million, right? Which, and again, there's some people on X, I think it was Cranjis McBasketball. He put out like a little chart numbers of like what, after taxes his contract would look like as, in LA versus what it would be in Yukon. And it's not really that much different. Right. So obviously there's been a lot of talk about them not really giving him the ideal offer. And it's not that it's not a lot of money. It's just that if that's the guy that you quote unquote believe should be, the steward for your, next chapter, then that's where you have to give him a Godfather offer because there's no real reason for him to have to leave the UConn situation unless he gets like, a boatload of money, right? And I think he was on, some of the sports shows and was like, yeah, there was an amount that I would have taken, although I guess we'll never know what it is. But either way, right, since that point, then it was wild, right? Because during that time period, right, during the Hurley, fiasco, right, there were some people, I think, it was Fanta and others putting out the idea that Reddick, the Reddick situation had cooled off, right, where it's like, he may not be as interested in that, and that the Lakers may not have been as interested in him, right? Because I think he was saying that there were some players on the Lakers who didn't really want to be coached by him, right? Assuming that there's only a handful of guys that would really have any real say in the coaching personnel. I think you can pretty much kind of figure out who that probably is, and it's not LeBron. Obviously, no sources, right? I don't have any sources, but I'm just saying I think we can who that would be, right? Probably the guy that wasn't on any of his all defensive teams. But either way, but then Shams kind of came out and was like, actually, he basically, took a shot at Woj and was like, no, it was actually Reddick pretty much, all along. And then Woj put out, now they're doing a formal interview with Reddick, and it sounds like that he's probably the front runner for the job, which is what we talked about, where it's like, okay, you kind of need to, if you're going to put all that Hurley stuff out there, you kind of have to get him because if you don't, right, then that means you're going to have to default back to what you were going to do before. And we didn't necessarily know how he was going to react. I was kind of surprised that people were saying that he was mad at the situation because I just feel like he
Hmm.
didn't really have any other offers.
Hmm.
So it's like, only because like I understand the idea of like maybe he didn't know maybe he was led on to think that he was the number one guy, but he doesn't have any offers. So it's not really like a scenario where it's like, what are you gonna do if you don't get the offer? Like you're not getting the Cleveland job. So it's like, I don't know. Like I
Right.
understand it, but at the same time, not really. But now it's like in the article, it was saying, yeah, he wasn't upset. He understood, which you expect that, right? Because of course, if you're the Lakers, you're gonna go after Dan Hurley before you go after JJ Redick.
Yeah.
If you have the opportunity to get him because he's a more proven guy. But now it sounds like it's probably gonna be Redick.
Yeah. And it's funny. I saw a lot of people, a lot of Laker fans. They were up in arms about everything.
Right.
Mainly the Hurley thing. I think that was
Yeah.
a huge fumble in terms of the
Yes.
contract that was offered. Like you said, you're
Right.
kind of supposed to offer him the farm and everything else.
Right.
It's people have been talking about, you know, the front office of the Lakers and, you know, just them being a little bit incompetent in this situation. I think their incompetence showed a little bit, and that's kind of being nice, I think, because a coach of Dan Hurley's caliber, I think he's proven he's a winner, like we talked about, and now you're defaulting back to JJ Redick, who we already know basketball IQ of like, genius, but hasn't coached a day in his life. So it's going to be an experiment. And that's rough and that's tough. But, what would an NBA offseason, or going into an NBA offseason be like without a little bit of, Lakers drama and some LA vibes to it. But,
Good
what is
time.
like where do you stand on it? Do you think like this is an embarrassment, in terms of letting Dan Hurley kind of slip through the cracks like that? Or, are you kind of content with JJ Redick, being your next guy?
I think the former is probably more accurate because I just, again, like it would be one thing if it was like we didn't know about any of this,
Mhm.
going on.
Mhm.
And then, like, maybe later on, we're like, oh, here's some other guys that maybe they reached out to. But the fact that, like, initially we were assumed, to believe that it was Reddick, and then it was him, right, Hurley, and everybody was like, oh wow, that's actually, pretty interesting, right? That's not what you would
Awesome.
have expected. Um, and then it didn't happen, and then it kind of gave you flashbacks to what happened, in previous years, right? Where it's like, they had Tyronn Lue, and that situation was, even crazier because it sounded like he was going to get it, right? They have the picture of him with the Lakers cake
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah.
Well, not because of the amount of money, but just because of the amount of years. It was literally just one extra year because they wanted to tie him to LeBron, which just made no real sense. Um, so, it's not the first time that they've kind of fumbled it. So, and it's obviously sparked a conversation about, like, is it actually a good job? But either way, yeah, I do think it's pretty rough, but it's kind of, I guess, also on brand as well because we've just seen at different times, like with the front office and the ownership, just a lot of mistakes, right? Obviously, they were still able to win a title, but you almost kind of feel like it might have just been because you just kind of lucked up into getting LeBron and AD, not necessarily that the process itself was actually great. Even though, like, to be fair, like, we've seen some good things at times, but like it's also at other times been some very bizarre decisions. So it's been kind of a mixed bag, even though there was a championship in there as well. So it's kind of hard to completely say. Like, I can't say it's a failure because you got a title. It
Right.
just feels like there was some, I don't know, there was still some food left on the table, which is where that's where you are disappointed. Because you just feel like as the Lakers, you should be going all out, to do some of these things as opposed to kind of just, I don't know, just kind of going half effort, but you just never know. Like, maybe he wasn't interested in going there anyways. It sounded like he would have been interested in it, but at the end of the day, you didn't get him. So now you kind of have to wear that on your sleeve, and now you're gonna have to get somebody else. And again, it's obviously very different. And I would have a lot more concerns because that was the hire where it's like I have nothing against Reddick personally. It's just I have nothing to draw from in terms of how good would he be as a coach because he's never coached. Obviously, we know he can analyze the game, so we know he understands it. But that's still a lot different than being a coach because there's other stuff you have to do. You have to manage personalities. You have to put together, strategy. You have to work with other people as well. And I don't necessarily know what to expect out of that. Like, is there anybody that can tell me like what systems would he run? What schemes does he like?
Right.
How does he see certain types of personnel? Right? How would he utilize, say, like a guy like LeBron or Anthony Davis? We don't know, right? And obviously you could ask questions like that about Ham, but it's still different because he was an assistant, so you would have at least some idea of the types of things that he would have done, well or not as well with, right? Like, obviously there were certain things that, like, you wouldn't know how good or bad he'd be at it until he actually coaches, but there would still be a little bit more to base things off of as opposed to somebody who hasn't done that at all. And I think that'd be a tough position, you know, for somebody that hasn't coached before, anyways, because it's not like you're going to a rebuilding team where you're probably going to be allowed to be able to make mistakes at times. You're going to a team that's got some superstars on there where, if it doesn't work out, in a year or two, you could just be gone.
Yeah. It's rough. I think this might be the team that we talk about the most this entire offseason, especially considering, what they're going to do in the draft, obviously the coaching position. And the crazy thing is they need to figure this out now, in terms of the coaching thing, because the draft is what, a
Right.
couple weeks from now.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
you got to figure it out. And I'm
Right.
curious what they do. The Bronny situation, we already know how we feel and stand on that. Don't draft him in the first round. Don't waste the first round pick on Bronny James. If he falls to you
Right.
in the second round, do it. But no, not first round. So, like I said, I think they're going to be the most talked about team in the offseason. Obviously, we already know, they're going to have some targets, some free agent targets. We all know that, they're always like looking to make moves. So, you know, it's the saga continues. It feels like it's a never ending saga, and I'm sure you feel that way as a Laker fan because I'm not even a Laker fan, and I feel like I know like Laker lore like the back of my hand.
Right. Yeah, because you just hear about it every year,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So
Yeah, like, you don't even have to hear from me. Like, you already
no,
know most of this stuff.
yeah,
So
it's all over Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. You see it on the talk shows, and that's just how it is. That they're a
yeah,
big
like,
market team. They
right.
have a lot of championships. Like we talked
Yeah.
about, one of the greatest organizations in sports history. But
Even during
what's
Yeah,
up?
even during the finals where they haven't been, in the playoffs since, for a couple of months. They're still being talked about towards the top of the tickets.
Exactly, which is crazy. But at the end of the day, that's how the game goes. But yeah, it's tough. I feel your pain in terms of searching for that head coach. It's rough.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of
Yeah,
candidates. That's the issue.
yeah. And
It'd be
again, I
different if
mean,
there was like a bunch of standouts. But
right.
you
Yeah.
fumbled the
And
best
again,
one.
I hope it works out, from the
Yeah, yeah,
perspective
yeah,
of like, I'm not hating, on him because I don't know him. I'm just
yeah.
saying like, it's not the signing that I would be that excited about personally, as a Laker fan. But all you can
Considering your
really do
guys'
is,
track record too,
yeah, yeah, that's all you can really do is just hope that it works out. That's really all you can do,
because they
because
tend to
it's
overcorrect a
not
little bit too much, bro.
right, a little. And then finally, New York Knicks. New York optimistic about new OG Anunoby, Isaiah Hartenstein contracts and free agency. So, it sounds like, according to Ian Begley of SNY, that a lot of people within the Knicks, which is interesting, believe that they have, a very good chance of bringing back both Anunoby and Hartenstein, which, again, to me, they need to do, right? Like, now the thing is that from a salary perspective, I think OG Anunoby can get a max of like 5 years, 245 million. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think obviously they will bring him back on whatever they need to do, right? Obviously, a team like Philly could possibly challenge just because they have a bunch of cap, and we know they're going to try to target any and everyone. But again, if you're OG, you're in a good spot, right? You're starting, you're in a pretty important role. You're going to play a lot, and you're in New York. And, again, you fit pretty well. So there's no real reason to leave unless another team just gives them more money, which, again, the Knicks can offer the most money. The Hartenstein one's a little bit different because of the fact that they can't offer him the most money. They can offer him about 16 a year, but there are other teams that can offer more because, again, they don't have the same type of bird rights or whatever. I think they signed him to like a 2-year deal or whatever, so
Hmm.
that's a lot different. So he can get, I think, 4 years, 72 and a half from the Knicks, but there are other teams that can give him more. People have said like OKC could be a target. So that's the one that's a little bit trickier, where if another team gives him more than that, he could leave. I just don't necessarily know if a team is actually going to give him more than that.
Right,
Like,
right.
wrong. Like, I could be wrong because obviously we've seen now that, like, the center position is still pretty important, which, I never thought it wasn't, but it's even more important now with, with there being a lot more size, on these rosters, right? Even the Celtics, right? Who have, like, Tatum at the 4, they still have, some physical bigs out there, right? And obviously Porzingis isn't quite as physical, but he's got size. So I think there could be a team that could be willing to throw it at him. Like I said, I just don't necessarily know if they're going to give him that much, because that's when you start getting into the tier of like that's a lot of money,
Yeah.
for him, and it's not even that he's bad. I just like I said, I would be surprised if a team gave him like 20 plus million a year. Of course, I've been wrong before, and I could be wrong, or it could just be a scenario where maybe a team gives him like 2 years and like 50 or something like that, right? Where
Yeah.
like they don't give him as long of term of a deal, but they give him, more money per year. So that could possibly happen. But I feel like the OG one, I think he definitely 100% or close, nothing's really 100%, but I think he is almost a lock to come back and resign. I think Hartenstein is probably a lower percentage, but I still think it's more than likely.
Yeah, I think they're both locks. With Hartenstein, I think he's a great player for what he does and for what he is, but I don't think he's a player where a lot of teams are going to be scrambling to overpay. That I
Mhm.
don't see him in that category. And I expect New York to kind of run it back, like we talked about, run it back,
Yes,
potentially, hopefully,
I do.
be healthy. Because we know that this team has a lot of potential, especially in the East and the way that the East is currently constructed. You should run it back because look at where you got. And you would have gotten even farther without all those injuries that you had.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like I said, I'm not saying he's leaving the Knicks at
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
I don't think it's quite as like certain as Anunoby, but I think they're
Right.
both Knicks next
Yeah.
year. I would be surprised if one of them is gone, because if you're the Knicks, there's no real reason to not bring them back. Like I said, the difference is with Hartenstein is they can't give him the most money,
Right.
but with the
Yeah.
Knicks, they literally can. So there's no reason for OG to be gone unless they just cheapen up.
Right.
But Hartenstein could be, less likely. But if you're the Knicks, you kind of have to because you don't have any other bigs other than Mitchell Robinson can't really, who's kind of unreliable in terms of his health. So, I think you'd be better off bringing Hartenstein back and Anunoby back, and then just adding whatever else is left over in free agency.
Agreed.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, right? NBA season, NBA finals, almost over, right? Pretty much at this point, right? Like no more than like a week or so left, if that. So obviously, we're almost through the end of another, year of this podcast, right? Year two almost in the books,
Yes,
right?
sir.
Again, shout out to Heat Nation, or excuse me, Heat Miami Heat Zone podcast, right, for having us on and collabing with them. Obviously, if you haven't already done so, check that out, and obviously be ready for our live stream. Concluding after the finals game, right? Assuming regardless of whether or not it's over, or not in terms of the series. And again, continue to like, comment, and subscribe, right? Obviously, if you leave a comment, we'll try to read it. We'll pick one and read it at the beginning of each video. So we appreciate all the support, and either we'll see you in the next live stream, or we'll see you on Monday.